Welcome back to Catch Some Soulshine. Today I'm joined with Cat Caldwell Myers. I met her at Cathy Heller's Summit Retreat for podcasters. So she is a fellow podcaster, and you may want to take a listen to her podcast. But we're going to talk about her journey of recovery and awakening her brilliance after some of life's darkest moments. So I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit better and we'll dig right in.
Thanks, Dawn. So good to see you, fellow podcaster. My podcast is called The Adventure Paradox, and it's really about embracing life as an adventure and working on those paradoxes that come up, the things that hold you back and that you have to deal with day to day, a lot of practical life. So my podcast is in the top 3% of all podcasts. I teach other people how to up-level their podcasts, and I love podcasting. Podcasting absolutely changed my life. It helped me get the book out that I had said I would write all those years about this epic adventure in young motherhood of finding myself, which is also called The Adventure Paradox. And I know when we met, I shared a different book with you, which is a more private book. You can't buy it on Amazon, but it's called Lots of Dots, The Professor Pony. And a lot of my work is with animals and bringing people home to themselves through working with animals and nature. So there you go. I live right outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. If you're ever out here, please come and visit. It's a very special, magical place. And I'm working on putting some retreats together to bring people out here with some pretty high level movers and shakers, because where else would you rather do the work than in this incredible place here?
Yeah, that's on my bucket list, Jackson Hole. It's absolutely gorgeous. So you just never know. I might have to join you one of these days.
Yep. Come on out. And I first came to Jackson, and we'll get into my story a little bit as you like, but in 1999 on a college ski trip from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I was coming back from a neck injury. I had broken my neck in a horseback riding accident, and I wasn't allowed to do a lot of the physical active things I love to do, like skiing, or at the time I was a snowboarder. And so it was my coming home, first ski trip after not being able to ski for a year. And I remember getting to these Tetons and recognizing just how special they are and feeling like I've come home and this is my healing place. And so since then, it's just been my whole life's journey has been about wherever I'm living. If I'm living in Chicago or I was in Boulder or wherever I am, it's about when am I going to get back to the Tetons? And that's true for a lot of people who come here, whether they ever make the move to live here, because there's, and I did make the move to live here. And I didn't think I'd get sober when I did. That was not part of the journey at that time, but it really calls, I think, to this depth of soul and wakes people up at a really deep level.
Yeah, I thought for me that was Florida, because I do have a little place in Sarasota and I love it there. But I have to tell you, after this last hurricane and the devastation that they encountered, and luckily my place is okay, but then it traveled all the way up the United States to where my daughter was living, which she's not going to be anymore. Such devastation. So I really have just recently settled into the fact that home is wherever I am. And right now, that is my little town of Bellevue, Ohio. And I look around, and we had the most beautiful sunrise this morning. The sky was red, and then I noticed that it was sprinkling. And then and then in the background, there was the sunshine. So, of course, we had huge, beautiful rainbows. And I thought, wow. And even my granddaughter, who's 6, getting her ready for school, she looks out the back and she goes, oh, I need to take a picture of this. So she got my camera out and she took a little picture. But yeah, I do feel like if you're called to a certain location, that's part of that. I'm really into the book, The Big Leap now. And it's part of your leap, right? Get out of your zone of excellence wherever you are and just make that leap so that you can get into your zone of genius. And in a way, that's what I'm doing right now because yesterday was my last day of work. I resigned. I didn't retire. I resigned from that position so that I can have more time to work on the things that are important to me. But I really want to get into your journey of recovery. Like, how did the addiction or obsession, get out of hand or take a hold of you? And then what are some of the things that you've discovered after you've found this path of recovery?
We talk a lot in recovery about footwork. And, I don't know if people are listening to this, but if you could see the images, Dawn and I were joking, her background, she has shoes in the background, right? And footwork. And that's because your daughter is home and you're not in your office right now. In my background, I have a horse. And what came through for me as I was doing the work preparing for that book coming out, The Adventure Paradox, is home is where the horses are for me. Horses, buffalo, the wildlife, the ranching community, farming, this area. When I moved here in 06, 07, I had worked as a Montessori teacher in the suburbs of Chicago. And that was, teaching felt like a soul calling, but there was this restlessness that I had inside me in my 20s. Working for my family was very difficult on certain levels. If you've ever been in a family job, you may have had the experience. You literally will give your blood for your family. For a lot of people in recovery, we have this deep level of tension that we're coming out of, whatever it is, and we don't have the tools to manage that tension. So at the time that I moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, I had no horses in my life. And that was very rare for me because I mean, obsessed with horses as a young girl. Like I would literally walk down the street, find the closest horses we could find, knock on the door, ask if we could pick up poop and care for their horses. You know what's funny about that, by the way, Dawn, is my girls have their own horses and they still want to do that for other neighbors and horses they fall in love with. So again, I really think it's this soul thing of being willing to do the work for something that like truly calls you. We're not ready till we're ready. So my journey and hitting bottom, as I started to come out of it, I was in a life coaching program with Debbie Ford, who you may or may not be familiar with. The Dark Side of the Light Chasers was her most famous book, but she wrote, I think, 13 or 14 books. One of them after she was dead, which was channeled through her sister, an unpublished book, very interesting. But anyway, I started doing some really deep work with her and really looking at my shadow, looking at the things I didn't want to be. And one of them was an alcoholic. And my dad and mom were both in recovery. So I was that little rug rat in the back of the room, like hearing the Serenity Prayer. We had it on a pillow in our house, the whole thing. And it was very clear to me, Dawn, I did not want what they had. So when I got into college, I was really worried about alcohol. And I went through, some other alternate routes of finding my Zen and chilling out. And none of those things were good for me. All of those things really brought me to my bottom. And I will say there were fun times, it was fun, then it was fun with problems, and then it was problems. And so for me, looking back at that time and looking at, and this is why so much of my work is really bringing people back to animals, because I believe that they ground us in a way that, you can sit in your home and be in the Tetons, be in this incredible place, but it's a blizzard and you don't want to go out in it. Well, how are you coming back to your soul, to that grounding? How are you working with another living creature and that nonverbal communication? And for me, horses look at you outside because they're not in your house. They're in your barn. So they start to help you really do that. So I felt called to work with horses again, right around the time I was doing this work with Debbie Ford and starting to look at myself and some of the behaviors I was engaging in that were not good for me or anybody else. When I got into recovery, I had had a lot of attempts to stay sober. Like I would make a New Year's resolution not to smoke pot anymore. And then I would get really drunk and I would smoke pot. And so I started to understand that the common denominator was actually alcohol. And when I was in this life coaching certification, I had to fill out every week, like we would set goals, Dawn. And I was like, I think the reason I didn't reach my goal is because I can't stop thinking about, this illegal drug, And they were like, we can't certify you as a life coach if you're doing these things. And I
Yeah.
was like, this is just how sick I was. So to understand, how I believe the dis-ease works, I was like, but I don't understand. I am being honest. So for me, that first step is honesty, but understanding how being honest actually impacts people. Like you can come in and say, well, honestly, I have a problem, but there's no solution in just honestly saying you have a problem. You're still in the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was like a complete rewrite, new playground, new playmates, and an entirely new way of life.
Right.
I wasn't ready for it until I was ready for it. It was like this psychic change where I suddenly saw that the common denominator in all my problems every time I was using. And I didn't know how to stop using. But I did know there was a place for me to come to, and it was this feeling of coming home when I stepped into a 12-step recovery group and started
Right.
really talking about what was really going on with me. And hearing others share the same way, and not just share in the space of, oh, woe is me, but share in the space of, and here's a solution. Or I can see the horizon of what I want it to look like or feel like. But here I am, and I know that's possible because I've seen other people walk through this. And so I'm just going to keep coming back. And that was over 15 years ago now.
So what are the things, because it's ironic, maybe it's not. One of what I developed over the weekend was my own 12-step formula for grief, loss, and recovery.
Mm.
Because what I discovered, and don't get me wrong, I love the 12 steps. Like I use them in my life, but I felt like there could be another layer for people that really want to go deeper and that really want to do that soul connection. So I developed these 12 steps, and I'd like your take on, I mean, I know you have the animal connection, but what are some other things that you have found that you really latched onto for your own healing and recovery?
Yeah, meditation is huge for me. So early on, I would light a candle and I would just stare at the flame. And I remembered my dad's story. He was a Boy Scout. And so he had like this frame of all these Boy Scout badges, probably like 60 of them, and a quarter of the frame was burned from
Oh,
the time when he was supposed to stare at a candle for an hour and he walked away and it burned half the desk down. But in the beginning, for me, something, and it talks about this in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It says we recoil from it as from a hot flame. And
yes.
so for me, like, I'm going to look at this flame, which is a little bit like looking at my dis-ease. I'm going to see it for what it is, and I'm going to blow it out. And it doesn't mean that I'm in remission. It means the flame is there, and as long as I don't walk away and let it keep burning, right? I take this time with it. That's been huge for me. And so the monkey mind, I'm a big fan of Pema Chodron. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she's a monk. And she was being interviewed in San Francisco. And they said, Pema, when the monkey mind comes up, what do you do? And she was like, oh, I just stop meditating. What a concept. Like, just blow the candle out, go do something else. And I had a gal I worked with for a while in early recovery who got me through the steps, who was like, her therapist told her, she was like, I got to meditate. There's all this literature. I got to get the 20 minutes. Like, it says it's 20 minutes. And she was like, why don't you just start with 2?
Right.
And so for me, like meditation, and I've done transcendental meditation. I joke that's trademarked meditation. There is something very powerful about that second meditation in a day. but you can start your day over at any time. And so for me, remembering prayer and meditation, I'm really big on praying in the bathroom, by the way. Why? Because you're going to be in and out of there a lot throughout the day. So it's a good moment to just like check in. How am I doing spiritually? Like, do I feel like I'm on the beam or am I a little bit off? That has been a huge, huge tool for me.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the key components of this program that I'm putting together is the creative facet. Like creativity, and there's more and more and more research about this. Like, for example, if you listen to music, it does something to your brain. It changes your brain,
Mm,
and they'll show imaging, and it lights up. But if you sing with a song or a music, it puts your brain on fire. And it doesn't matter if you're a good singer, good quote, or not so good singer. All that matters is that you sing.
mm,
And it's the same way with art journaling, right? If you look at art, if you look at a beautiful piece, because I'm noticing the horse behind you and it's just beautiful and I love it.
mm,
And it just evokes a feeling, an emotion in me. But if you participate in doing art, it
mm.
takes it to a whole new level. And that's the kind of stuff that I really want to focus on in this next 12-step journey.
Mm,
And it's just a journey because, right, we're never off the journey. We're always on the journey of self
mm,
growth and realization. But with your animals, that's another form of connection and raising that vibration, your vibration. But what are some creative things that you have done that have helped with your recovery?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I was thinking back, the year I got into recovery, I drove an art car. If you're familiar with art cars, my particular art car started out as a Subaru Forester. It was white. We called it Snow White. And then she drifted. She got zebra stripes. And then the zebra stripes turned into like colorful murals of safaris and all kinds of things were going on, sunsets and I had elk antlers on her, and I had a horn that whinnied like a horse.
Hmm.
So the point is, I was pretty well known in my town prior to uh, stopping my drinking and driving, and maybe not necessarily in such great ways either. Which was something I had to come around to and make amends for. But I had a lot of creativity flowing, but I didn't have, like I wanted to express myself and help and do things in the world. And I could see the things that were wrong, but maybe I wasn't going about it in the best way. Maybe,
Mhm.
that car broke down, Dawn, when I was a couple of months sober.
Hmm.
And I got a ride from some friends of mine. This is a little bit of a tangent story. I will come back to creativity. But I hopped in the car with these guys. We're on Teton Pass, which is also where I met my husband later, like 10 years later. Anyway, 2 years later. And they were both drinking beers. They were drinking roadies. And they handed, do you want one? And I remember it was the first time that I was alone, like in a car with old friends. Wouldn't have planned for it, but my car had broken down, right? And I chose the clean ride.
Mhm.
And it was just me and God. Like nobody else would know really, like and that was a really powerful moment. And it was also the beginning of me recognizing as a vehicle, my creative vehicle, because car artists talk a lot about how, the ego is so attached to your car, to your vehicle. You basically have an art opening wherever you go. And if you start going down the rabbit hole of it never being finished, you're doing art everywhere. And I was doing art in the Tetons, in public spaces. I was, on the paper for all these things. Like I was really out in it, but it didn't like have a direction. It was like just about the process of doing it. And some of those paints would make me pretty sick and, this and that. So after that, I knew the vehicle I needed. At this point, I had my own horse. I needed a truck. so I could haul with the trailer, right?
Mhm.
Like, for me, it's been this experience of expansiveness, of seeing like what's possible and what's truly needed to take care of the whole family, you know, and if you followed along the dream horse trailer, all the things that came. But for me, early on in recovery, it's a very simple act of creativity in that connection with other people. And for me, it was in service. I ended up taking over a women's fitness franchise. I had over 800 members, and I was just engaged in service, in teaching, in working with others. And now that you mention it, there's a lot of creativity going into that. Like, that's where my creativity was going. And I'd really put down my paintbrush and these other things because I also saw it as part of my dis-ease, to be honest. And then later, like with the podcast coming back through, with these gifts awakening, like sobriety is not a one-day journey. It's not your 1 month. It's not your first year. It is all of those things, but it's also this journey of going deeper into who you really are. And we came here to create, as Cathy Heller says. Like, we came here to create. So of course, the longer you go, the deeper you go, these different things can come out of you. And it might not be a paintbrush. You know, when I wrote that book, I talked about the shaman's 4 questions to diagnose soul sickness. And one of them is, when did you last sit in silence? When were you last taken in by stories of enchantment? When did you last dance? Which I see service as a dance. And when did you last sing? So coming right back to what you were talking about, because it's like, until we actually embody the act in ourselves of creating, you know, through our voice, through our hand, through our touch, through that stillness, because that's sometimes when and where it comes, we're not really living fully.
Right. So my experience was, after, I had been in recovery for several years, and then Brad died, my son, and it just took me down to a place of deep despair. And what I did was throw myself into service work. I was doing everything and helping so many people, and it did feel good, and it helped carry me through that point to a certain extent. But it wasn't until after I had my second loss, when my sister, who had gone to the Art Institute and has her degree, invited me over. We were just going to I was just going to get a weekend away, to just get away from everyone. And I get there, and she's got the whole table set up. We're painting. And I was very resistant. But I did sit down and paint. And really, it was the first time since Brad had died that I sat still for a long period of time and just painted and got into me. And I felt joy, and I felt peace and serenity in that moment. And that's when I knew I was onto something. Like, here's what I need to pursue further. So it's been a huge part of my recovery from loss.
You're making me think of The Artist's Way. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like the loss piece, and I'm just finishing a series on my podcast called Life and Death. And actually the drop next week is with a death doula, which, talk about being uncomfortable, but also a whole other level of perspective around death, especially when you know it might be coming, for the survivors of a loss, right? Because we're not doing the work around this, is what I see culturally as a society. The same with recovery, but some people are. Some people are like you, Dawn. You're doing it, and leading the way. And I feel like with Lots of Dots, and I don't know how much of this I shared with you, but he was my first pony at 39, for my kids, really. This amazing, amazing experience. And then in the pandemic, we started teaching pony camps with him. And I taught lots of families, adults and children, how to be comfortable around horses, around themselves. And then he got a cancer, and I knew that we were going to have to put him down. And how do you, as a group, this animal that you've put so much energy into, connecting with, who's taken you through this really difficult time, and now you know he's going to go. Along with all these collective losses and collective traumas we experienced in the pandemic, now this thing that he's going to go, and he's going to be on the other side. And so that's when that book came through, the Lots of Dots book, which is written from his perspective, kind of like Black Beauty, about what animals need, which is often what we need too, right?
Mhm.
To calm down. So I feel like there is a really deep connection for me between creativity and loss and learning how to channel. And I think if you go way back to caveman times, it was on the wall.
Mhm.
It was on the wall, and the oral story tradition of the stories that were passed down. This has always been part of us, but we disconnect ourselves, especially when we're in a state or we're going deeper and deeper in that loss or that darkness, and we just don't have a way out, which is where, for me, having a teacher, having a
Mhm.
structure, having someone who can say, I know you're going to have days where like nothing makes sense, but I'm still here for you and I love you. And I've had those days,
Mhm.
and another day is going to come around.
Yeah, same. Yeah, our journeys are similar but different. Um, but the meaty parts of the journey are the same, using the tools to, pull ourselves. I couldn't see the light. I really couldn't when I was in the darkness, but I could see it through other people.
Mm-hmm.
And those people reached a hand into that darkness and help scurry me along the trail until I started to see bits and pieces of the light. And you know, I don't think that recovery or grief loss or anything is a linear thing. It's a spiral thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are points in time where it'll just sneak right up on you, and you're like, why am I crying? What is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just part of the journey. It's spiral, it's circular, it's never ending. When you've lost, something or someone that's really very, very special to you, it's okay to cry once in a while. The point is, I'm not stuck there all the time. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not there. I'm really happy, joyous, free. I have a lot of exciting things happening and life is good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's okay to be sad sometimes too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's another thing culturally. We have this idea that you're supposed to be happy, happy, joy, joy all the time. And that
Mhm.
is just not true. I
Right.
mean, the reality of a human being is that we have this whole spectrum of feelings. And to say that these are good and these are bad is to cut off the wholeness of who we are and what we came here to experience. And, you know, in this process of the Life and Death series, I interviewed folks who lost both their parents, all their siblings, grief guides, lost a child, and the through line I found was that those of us who have experienced really, really deep loss, those are often the ones who know how to shine brighter. And, it's reminding me of a gentleman, um, and his sister wrote a book, pretty famous book called What Looks Like Bravery. It's about loss, and it's also about medical assisted euthanasia, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And I didn't know the whole story until I read the book, but I did know her brother really well. And I remember he came back from break one time, and his dad had died of cancer, and he had this grin on his face, Dawn, like this. And it didn't stop. And we were like, Jake, like, are you okay? And he was like, I have just experienced the saddest thing in my life, and I've made a commitment to be happy as much as I can because of it. And you will not see me stop smiling.
Mm.
And I remember, it was almost uncanny, right? But also recognizing, oh, we have a choice at any time, even in the most soul shattering loss, to say, I'm going to show up and try to smile,
Mhm.
because that is too much. And I
Yeah.
think that, like, that disconnect, and, he's a teenage boy, like, imagine, right? But to be able to then come around to, and this is a lot of the work that she does in this book, where are the places you can go to feel the full on frown of how you feel about this in your life? How do
Right.
you still feel about it 10 years later, 10 days later? Like the grief journey, it's not like, oh, it happened here and then it was over. Like it keeps coming, like with
Right.
dots, that was the first horse we put down. There's a lot of other things
Yeah.
putting a horse down. We have another one coming up. You experience it again. I remember the
Mm.
very first horse I ever put down. Like it's every loss. I know we're almost at time, so I think I just like in wrapping up, I just want to say whatever your gateway is,
Yeah.
right? To the next level, like whatever your door, and it might be through an animal. The number of people I know who have cut themselves off from a desire to have a cat, have a dog, have a horse, because they feel like they don't have the time or they can't afford it or whatever it is. They're sucking time out of their soul journey by doing that, and that I believe is again the gateway to some of the greatest healing that I have witnessed in others and in myself, and the greatest expansion, and to your point, creativity, because you've got to get creative to make
Hmm.
it. You've got to be willing to pick up the horse manure, to ride the horse,
Hmm. Yeah, for
work.
sure. Wow. A lot of great insight. I love all of it, and I think we're onto something really big here. So, where can people reach you? I know you mention your podcast again, and then I'll put all of that information in the show notes as well.
Awesome. First, Dawn, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And you are such a bright light. And I love that this work is coming through and that I got to talk to you the weekend after it started coming through. And I can't wait to see what you do with it. So thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
If you guys want to find me, my podcast is The Adventure Paradox, and my website is theadventureparadox.com, on Instagram at The Adventure Paradox, also on Facebook, and you can follow me at Cat Caldwell Myers.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey of transformation and growth. I wanted to thank you personally and invite you to download a free journal that I've created, and I will drop links in the comments. Hit that bell if you're on YouTube, and subscribe to the channel on Apple or Spotify. Leave me a rating because that really does help expand the reach. Keep catching that soul shine. I'll see you next week.